Back in 1989, Nature, the International Journal of Science, reported Dr. David Chiswell as saying the early days were exciting times because we didn't know what we were doing, and nobody in the world believed that antibodies were really good. Despite this, Cambridge Antibody Technology went on to develop HUMIRA, the first human antibody isolated by phage display. Our story begins with a chance meeting of three people at Amersham International.
So I remember the time that Amersham International decided to close their little group in the technology department in corporate research at Amersham, and almost immediately Dave came up with the idea of forming a new company and move. And we discussed where it would be. I decided from the start that that was the path I wanted to take, and I'm so glad that I did, and I'm so glad that my path led me to be in Dave's group at the time that this was happening, because I moved over to Cambridge. I became one of the founders at Cambridge Antibody Technology with Dave and Greg Winter. We came up with phage display technology. Our little company generated the HUMIRA, the drug that went on to become the world's biggest selling drug. And all of this was me being in the right place, i.e. working with Dave at the right time. And we were able to beat the pack, as it were, because a number of other groups had similar thoughts about making phage display work. So that day in the office when Dave told me that we were about to be kicked out, what looked like a cloud actually was a cloud with a very silver lining.
So I'll just explain what Amersham International was, because people may not be familiar with it. So at the time Dave joined, it was probably the world's leading supplier of radioactive products for medicine and for research and for industry. And that probably sounds like an unlikely place for him to learn the skills he obviously had later on in his career, but actually not. And the reason was that the group he was joining was going to do something completely different from anything that Amersham had done before.
Sir Gregory, how did you first meet David Chiswell?
I met him when I was consulting for Amersham. So I'd invented a way of humanizing mouse antibodies, and Amersham had decided to take a license to it. And the MRC had asked me to help the folks at Amersham by acting as a consultant.
Amersham went further than just the idea of making non-radioactive products for the molecular biologists. They decided to set up a group that would do more basic type of research aimed ultimately towards product development, but not likely to result in products in the immediate future. And that was how my understanding is that's how he met Greg Winter and started the collaboration with Greg, who was at the MRC. And Amersham then changed its mind after a few years and decided not to have a group that was not directly developing new products. But Dave felt that what they'd been doing with Greg was significantly important, and so decided to leave and form CAP with Greg.
One spring day, either spring or early summer in 1989, I arrived for our meeting, and Dave said, "Well, there's no point in having a meeting." He said, "We've all been fired. Maybe you could just tell us about what you're doing at the moment," because I was consulting on humanizing antibodies, but I developed a technology, or the beginnings of a technology, that later became the basis for a startup company.
How would you summarize the success of Cambridge Antibody Technology?
CAT's biggest achievement was it took a technology that I'd started, and together with the laboratory, because we worked sort of hand in hand with my research group during the first few years of CAT. We managed to develop that technology, make it commercial, and it all led to the first human antibody to be approved for therapy, which was HUMIRA.
So the story of HUMIRA really started because of a personal relationship between Dave Chiswell and Bob Kamen, who was at BASF. They'd both been postdocs at the ICRF together. Bob had seen our paper in Nature describing this new technology for making fully human antibodies. There were already a couple of drugs in progress at the time to neutralize TNF, which is what HUMIRA does. And really, they were looking for a fast follower using our newly described phage display technique and technology. So we could see running ahead of us were a couple of other products. And eventually we realized that, our product was taking over and coming in leaps and bounds. Did I know or expect that it was going to be the world's biggest selling drug? It certainly each year for the last 6 years was the world's biggest selling drug, and on a cumulative basis, in total, the world's biggest selling drug. No, I can't say that I foresaw that, and of course, we're all delighted with the history of that coming from our little company in Cambridge.
Jane, in very simple terms, can you tell me what is a phage library?
So we all make antibodies. Our own immune responses make antibodies that help protect us against different diseases. And the idea behind CAT was that we could take the genes that encode all those antibodies that we make as individuals and put them onto the surface of a bacteriophage. So that's something that infects bacteria. And then you could create libraries of these bacteria that were all expressing different human antibodies from people who potentially could be protecting, using the antibodies to protect against disease. So it was making very, very large arrays of these phage libraries. And the challenge then was to choose which antibodies that we wanted to select and identify to turn into drugs. And that was part of the real sort of up and down journey of CAT in the early days, was working at, once we got this technology working, how we could apply it to make medicines. One of the early antibodies that was made from the libraries was an antibody to Tumour Necrosis Factor-α, which became HUMIRA, one of the best-selling drugs in the world. So we had some good collaborators. We had some interesting opportunities there, but how we applied the technology was really critical. And Dave was always strategizing about that in a very clever and informed way.
Everybody who joined CAT in the early days remembers their employee number, and I remember mine was employee number 50, and it's sort of ingrained. So you can think of a small company, 50 people, certainly years and years away from turning profit, but with legit great expectations and legitimately great expectations. And leading it all was Dave, and Dave was unwavering in his confidence about the company's future. I mean, one of the endearing things about Dave was that he was very much concentrated on the long term. So he had this vision of C8 in 5 or 10 years hence, and everything. And it was a successful vision, you know. But everything that we needed to do on the way to get it there was just a minor perturbation in his eyes. But he'd assembled a group of young, enthusiastic people who just loved working there. And as I say, it was a wonderful environment, and a lot of that was down to Dave's example and his leadership.
I think he always wanted to set up a company. I said to him, Dave, if you're going to try and run this company, why on earth do you want to do it? I imagine it's going to be a pretty hard job. He said, well, I'm from Birmingham. That's the kind of thing we aspire to. So, which I thought was very funny, and it stuck with me. And I remember his office, he had a whole bookshelf full of things like business for dummies, or how to make your first million, and things like that, which I thought was quite funny. But I also, again, warned him, because he didn't mind saying, yeah, well, we have to learn on the job. And that's what we did.
Sir Gregory, I imagine the Nobel Prize must have been your ultimate accolade.
I got it, but I was very glad to invite Dave and actually John McCafferty to come with me, along with some other key members of the group, because they had a really important contribution to that piece of work. It couldn't have been done without them.
How important are the contributions David Chiswell has made to science, and in particular biotech?
Well, it's very important. I mean, he wouldn't have gotten the OBE if he hadn't. And that award that Dr. Winter's got, the Nobel Prize, Dave was the lead author on the paper. That, obviously there was more than one paper, and it was the whole lab that made the discoveries, and Dr. Winters led the lab. But it was after Dave joined that lab that they used that technology, the phage display technology, which is a way isolating relatively low concentration protein you want in the middle of a whole, thousands of other proteins, and then displaying it and expressing it in concentrations that are useful therapeutically. And Dave was a major contributor to that effort. And of course, that was the basis for that Cambridge Antibody Technologies company that he and Greg founded.
Diane, what was your role at CAT?
I started off as the legal counsel, the in-house legal counsel. They'd just done their IPO and they'd raised some money, and they wanted to have a full-time lawyer working for them. So I was working very close. I sat right outside Dave's office, next to the CFO's office, who recruited me. Yeah.
I understand you fought some important legal battles in your days at CAT. Is there a particular one you recall?
In the industry we were in, battles and disputes happened all the time, particularly when there was money involved. And you'll have probably heard from other people that CAT and under Dave's leadership was responsible for a drug called HUMIRA, which went on to be and still is one of the largest selling drugs in the history of biologics. But this dispute arose at the time when the company, a big American company called Abbott, who had acquired the partners we had been working with, decided they didn't really want to pay us all the royalties we thought were due. And at the time, we thought it was worth a few $100 million. If we'd only known what was at stake, you've had to add a few more zeros onto that. And the nature of the trial, which took place in the UK, was 2 weeks in a courtroom down in London. And it really was all pivotal upon Dave and his legal counsel, Anthony Nixon. But Dave had done all the negotiations and was the man who was responsible for making sure that CAT got what it deserved to do. And he was absolutely brilliant at that. And at the end of it all, the judge summed up the evidence. And there was a lot of dispute about who remembered what when. And this is the judge's words now. If you don't mind, I'll read to you. I have read and reread the relevant passages of Dr. Chiswell's cross-examination. My view now is what it was during the trial. Dr. Chiswell's evidence was compelling and credible. And he also went on in another part of the judgment to say that he was someone of integrity, which clearly came through. And needless to say, we won the case, and the money flowed in due course.
How important are the contributions David Chiswell has made in the field of biotech?
I think he's made a huge contribution, because I think in having the success of Cambridge Antibody Technology, which was at that stage probably one of Britain's most successful biotech companies, and indeed his tenure for quite a long time, as the CEO of the company, and his further work with the Bioindustry Association, I think all of those things meant that he sort of became, one of the key figures in British biotech.
I'm sure he felt people like me and his other colleagues, we were just pulling him back down to earth at all times, going, no, that's not going to happen, that's too much. But he would never listen. Luckily, he never listened to us, and he was all quite right not to. But he would always go for the biggest, grandest thing and wouldn't be deterred by mere practicalities or details or lack of money or the many problems that we had along the way. And I'd say his breadth of vision and his ability to drag us on along with him was the greatest.
Dave went on to several other biotech companies and also served at that time. And but he was very modest. He rarely mentioned any of this stuff, maybe just little bits and pieces, and you'd pick up one of these nuggets that he mentioned. He said, well, what exactly was that? And like the last trip we were with, he mentioned that something about, when Greg got the Nobel Prize. And I said, well, did you get to go? Oh, yeah, I was there and I met the people and everything. And really? And I said, so when you got the OBE, you met the Queen? Well, yeah, she gave me the OBE, So, but, you'd have to kind of pull this out of him. I think it was Linda that told us that he got the OBE, not David.
When I joined with my impeccable timing, CAT, British biotech was really in the doldrums. There'd been a couple of high-profile failures. The industry wasn't particularly well regarded in the city. And I think what Dave did first with Cambridge Antibody Technology and then with other companies like Kymab, and there was many others along the way, was he produced successful companies that made big returns for investors.
He had a unique blend of skills, right? So first of all, he was razor sharp, right? He was a brilliant immunologist in his own right, and he was great at science, right? So when you're working in biotech companies, having somebody who understands science makes a big difference. Having the experience of leading CAT and being really a pioneer, he really understood the ecosystem of biotech. But I think his third quality, was probably the most important quality, and one that I tried to aspire to. He was a great listener, and he was able to listen carefully and then speak at the right time. And I think those three qualities served him well as our chairman.
Dave was very unassuming, a fantastic listener, and I think he really brought out the best in people. He would, absorb what everybody had to say, take it all in. I think probably he was introverted in that way, that he could just really absorb what was going on around him, but came out with just absolute points of brilliance. And, his knowledge of science and what could work was very impressive, particularly for me, a non-scientist, just to see him working, and his ability to raise money. I mean, for a finance director, bringing money in is always a headache. But within 3 months of joining Kymab, David raised $50 million. And within another 18 months, he'd raised another $100 million. But I did land on my feet as a finance director to have such a force of nature working, that was able to raise that kind of money. As we all know, biotechnology is a tough game, and bringing in money is very, very hard. So to have raised the 150 million in that short period of time was just fantastic.
Dave was an unbelievable pioneer, right? He effectively pioneered biotech in the UK, and then with that experience, worked on multiple companies in multiple boards. So his impact on biotech is lasting, both from a science perspective, from a company formation perspective, but also a mentoring perspective. And so his legacy in our industry will go on for many years.
Where would you put Cambridge Antibody Technology in the scheme of things?
It was very pioneering, technologically very advanced. We were the first company really to show that you could make fully human antibodies, up until which point antibodies were either, chimeric or humanized with CDR grafting, but had elements of mouse sequences in them. So we were the first company really that showed you could produce fully human antibodies for therapeutic uses. It was obviously a joint effort between Kat and Greg's team at the LMB. So really at the cutting edge of science. That's the first thing I think Kat was known for. And I think it could have gone on to be a massive company. I think the company was bought by AstraZeneca, I think in the early to mid 2000s. I think if it had raised further money, if it had gone on to develop its internal pipeline of projects and products, it could have gone on to be another Amgen or another Genentech, something like that. I think it had that potential. And I think had it not been bought by AstraZeneca, it probably would have gone on to achieve those heights.
The big contribution that we made together, and especially Dave, was in the development of that phage display technology. It's now used. I remember looking through the top 20 pharma companies in the world a few years ago and just sort of ticked them all off. Every single one of them is using phage display in one way, shape or form. There's currently 183 approved antibody drugs, an increasing number of which are fully human, and many of those coming from phage display technology. So I think that the number of approved drugs and forthcoming drugs in the future that emerge from phage display, I think, is the greatest testament anyone can make, or the greatest legacy anyone can leave behind.